Dawn crept across the English countryside like a pale ghost, slow and uncertain, brushing a thin veil of silver mist over the airfield at Bodney. The world was holding its breath. The hum of engines in distant hangars trembled through the damp ground, mingling with the low chatter of mechanics and the metallic clank of tools against fuselage. Every man on that field knew what day it was, even if no one dared say the word aloud. They had waited for months for the order to come, and now that it had, silence fell like a curtain over everything. Rows of P-51 Mustangs stood ready, their canopies glinting faintly in the new light, their shark-toothed noses painted in bravado that none of their pilots truly felt. They were machines of speed and fire, built for dominance, but in that hour, they looked like hounds straining against invisible chains, trembling for the hunt. Among them, one Mustang was different. Its paint was dulled by age and salt air, its fuselage patched where shrapnel had bitten deep months before over Anzio. The crew called it Widow's Wail. Though few liked to speak the name, it carried a kind of curse with it. Its pilot, Lieutenant Jack Mercer, stood beside it with a stillness that masked a storm beneath the surface. His orders were clear. He was grounded, marked unfit for flight due to combat exhaustion after a string of missions that had pushed both man and machine to the edge. But Mercer wasn't built for waiting while others fought. His eyes, grey and hollowed by sleepless nights, followed the fog as it rolled low across the tarmac, hiding and revealing the aircraft like fleeting ghosts of battles past. Inside the ready room, the air was thick with nerves. Cigarettes burned down to filters between clenched fingers. Coffee steamed untouched in tin mugs. Maps covered the walls, marked with red grease pencil lines that bled into one another. France, the Channel, Normandy, Caen. Names of places that by nightfall would mean everything or nothing at all. Over the static hiss of the radio came fragments of voices, dispatches from across the sea, words like landing craft, heavy fire, paratroopers down. Each transmission drove home the same truth. The invasion had begun, and the clock had started ticking on every man's fate. Mercer lingered by the doorway, watching as younger pilots were briefed for escort duty. They looked barely old enough to shave, faces pale beneath the harsh fluorescence. One boy, eager and trembling, asked what it would be like. No one answered him. There was no language for that kind of question. The commanding officer, a man worn down to hard lines and quiet anger, read out call signs and formation details. Mercer's name was not among them. The omission burned more than any reprimand. When the briefing ended, the men filed out toward their planes, helmets under arms, boots crunching over gravel slick with dew. Mercer stayed behind, staring at the wall map where the English Channel lay between red and blue chalk line, a narrow strip of water that today would swallow thousands. By 5:45, the first engines were roaring to life. One by one, the Mustangs leapt down the runway and vanished into the grey morning, their propellers cutting through fog like blades through fabric. The field emptied quickly, replaced by the hollow echo of absence. Mercer walked alone between the dispersal bays, the smell of oil and cordite heavy in the air. He reached Widow's Wail and ran a gloved hand along her flank, feeling the cold rivets and the faint hum of dormant power. He remembered Italy, flak exploding over black water, tracer rounds stitching the sky, and the moment his wingman went down in flames. That was the mission that got him grounded. Command said he'd flown too low, broken formation to chase a retreating German fighter, risked the squadron. Maybe they were right, but he'd watched a friend die and he'd learned that following orders didn't always mean saving lives. A mechanic, a young corporal with grease on his face, approached hesitantly. "Sir, you're not cleared for takeoff," he said quietly, as if afraid the words themselves might spark something dangerous. Mercer didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the horizon, where the fog was thinning, and beyond it, the faint thrum of distant artillery could already be felt through the air. The corporal followed his gaze and swallowed hard. "They're gonna need everyone they've got over there, aren't they?" Mercer said finally. The boy nodded. "Then they'll need me." The radio on the operations table burst suddenly into life, sharp and panicked, static, then a voice shouting over gunfire. "This is Eagle Squadron! We've lost contact with the bombers over Pointe du Hoc. Flak's heavy. Repeat, flak's tearing us apart. We need cover." The controller shouted for all available aircraft to respond, but there were none. Every Mustang on the field was already across the channel. Every pilot except one. Mercer looked once more at Widow's Wail. The decision wasn't made. It simply was. He climbed into the cockpit as naturally as breathing. Switches flicked. Gauges trembled. The Merlin engine coughed, and then roared to life with the raw sound of defiance. The mechanic shouted for him to stop, waving his arms. But Mercer couldn't hear him anymore. Orders, fear, consequence, none of it mattered. The air was alive again, the Mustang trembling like a caged animal desperate to run. He shoved the throttle forward, the propeller slicing the mist as the plane surged down the runway. Officers ran from the control tower, waving, yelling. Too late. Widow's wail lifted into the air, her silver wings catching the first light of day, as if she'd stolen fire from the sun itself. Behind him, the airfield faded into a grey blur. Ahead, the channel stretched like a sheet of steel, and beyond it lay the thunder of D-Day, where men were already dying and history was demanding witnesses. Mercer banked east, the radio crackling in his ears. His pulse steadied. Whatever waited for him over that horizon, court-martial, flak, death, it didn't matter. He was going anywhere. Tell me where you're watching from before we continue this story. The channel lay beneath him like a living thing. Grey, restless, sheets of mist clung to the swallowing the horizon. But Mercer's instincts cut through it, like the nose of his Mustang. The cockpit was alive with vibration, dials trembling. The Merlin's growl deepened as he climbed into thick clouds that rolled toward France. Every few seconds, the radio spat static and fragments of chaos, half words and broken pleas from pilots already engaged over the beaches. He caught flashes of code names, Utah, Omaha, Gold, but each was drowned by the steady drum of artillery echoing across the water. Through the canopy, the early light fractured into streaks of gold and smoke. Below him, an armada unlike anything the world had ever seen, moved steadily toward the continent. Hundreds of ships, black dots crawling across the sea, carrying men who had never seen combat, many of whom never would again. From that height, they looked small and fragile, and Mercer felt a surge of something raw, not pride, not fear, but a kind of awe for the magnitude of what they were all about to do. The cloud bank thinned as he approached the French coast. Then came the sound, the one every pilot feared and remembered. Flak. Black bursts exploded ahead, tearing open the sky in jagged, thunderous blooms. The Mustang shuddered as fragments pinged against the fuselage, and Mercer gritted his teeth, pushing through. Below him, he saw them. B-26 bombers flying low, scattered and off formation, weaving through the chaos like wounded birds. German 88s from the cliffs at Pointe du Hoc were firing relentlessly, bursts of white smoke marking every missed shot. He could see the grey shapes of gun emplacements on the bluff, the flash of their barrels, and the arcs of tracer rounds streaking up. The bombers were defenseless now, their escorts driven off or destroyed. One of them trailed black smoke, another spiraled down toward the beach. The voice on the radio, the one that had called for help, broke through again, strained, barely human. "We can't hold. Need cover. God, where are they?" Mercer pressed the transmit switch. "This is Widow 1, inbound from Bodney. Hold your line. I see you." He dove. The Mustang screamed as it dropped through the smoke, cutting through layers of flak and flame. The altimeter spun, the G-forces pressing against his chest, but Mercer held steady. Below, the grey coastline rushed up at him. Beaches, cliffs, fire, movement. He could make out landing craft smashed against the surf, men crawling through sand and wire, explosions blooming in unnatural rhythm. He levelled just above the waves, pulling in behind the first group of bombers, his guns armed and ready. Tracer fire lanced past the canopy, the world reduced to split-second decisions. A German battery on the ridge swung its barrels toward him. He squeezed the trigger. The Mustang's .650 caliber Brownings erupted, the recoil jolting through the frame as red streaks tore into the gun pit. The position vanished in smoke. He banked right, lined up another. Short, controlled bursts. Precise. One by one, the German guns fell silent. The bombers regrouped above him, a few of them rocking wings in acknowledgement. Mercer didn't respond. He just kept firing until his last belt of ammunition ran dry. When the smoke finally began to thin, Mercer climbed again, his breath shallow, eyes stinging from the sweat and smoke that clung to the inside of his mask. Over the radio came voices of disbelief. "Who the hell was that?" one said. "We thought everyone was gone." Another replied, "Some crazy bastard from Bodney just saved our skins." Mercer didn't care who heard him. "Stay on course. Drop your load on those batteries. I'll cover you." The bombers wheeled, their payloads tumbling down into the coastal defences below. The ground convulsed in a chain of detonations that sent columns of dust and fire clawing into the air. From above, the destruction was terrible and magnificent, and Mercer knew it would be remembered not for him, but for the nameless men on the beaches who would live a few seconds longer because of it. As he pulled up through the smoke, his radio crackled again. This time the voice of his commanding officer back in England. Widow 1, you are flying unauthorized. Return immediately or face grounding and court-martial upon landing. The words hit him like ice, but there was no turning back now. He looked down at the coastline, at the flashes of artillery, the crawling figures, the crimson spreading through the sand, and knew that if he landed now, it would mean nothing. War didn't wait for orders, it demanded choices, and he had already made his. For the next 15 minutes, Mercer circled above Normandy, diving again and again on German positions, his guns empty, using only the speed and roar of his Mustang to draw enemy fire away from the retreating bombers. It was madness, it was desperation, it was everything the manuals told him never to do, but every round fired at him was one less aimed at. Eventually, his fuel gauge began to dip dangerously low. The Merlin engine coughed once, steady again, then coughed a second time, a warning. Mercer banked north, back toward the channel, leaving behind a coastline that burned like the mouth of hell. He didn't look back, he couldn't. As he crossed into open sky, the sun finally broke through the clouds, lighting the water below like molten steel. He realized his hands were shaking uncontrollably. He wasn't sure if it was adrenaline, exhaustion, or something else. Over the radio came quiet static, then a single voice, low and strained. Whoever you are up there, thank you. Mercer said nothing. He switched frequencies, silence filling the cockpit once more. There was no glory in what he'd done, only the strange calm that comes when a man knows he's disobeyed everything he was taught in the name of something larger than himself. The channel stretched before him like a long road home, and behind him, history had already begun to shift. If stories like this move you, if you believe in courage that defies command, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what comes next. The storm Mercer had left behind followed him like a ghost. As Widow's Whale crossed the channel, streaks of smoke trailed far below where the invasion fleet continued its relentless crawl toward France. The sky was a battlefield of its own, fractured clouds lit from beneath by explosions, the faint glimmer of sunlight fighting to break through the haze. Mercer's oxygen mask pressed against his face, his breathing shallow and mechanical. His fuel gauge hovered perilously near empty, but his mind was still in the chaos he had just left behind. He could see it every time he blinked, the cliffs, the burning batteries, the black silhouettes of bombers limping home. And beneath it all, the terrible persistence of men moving across beaches that seemed made of fire. He switched radio channels again, trying to find the frequency of his squadron, only static. The silence inside the cockpit grew heavy, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the Merlin engine. Somewhere over mid-channel, a voice finally came through, sharp, clipped, official. Unidentified aircraft. This is Bodney Control. Identify yourself immediately. Mercer hesitated. His call sign had already been recorded, his disobedience already known. This is Widow 1, he said quietly, returning to base. Low fuel. There was a pause on the line, then a colder voice. His commanding officer, Colonel Reeves. Widow 1, you were ordered to stand down. Do you copy? Mercer's eyes fixed on the horizon, the faint outline of England emerging through the fog. Copy, he answered. I'll face it when I land. Reeves said nothing after that. The transmission ended, leaving only the whisper of static, like distant rain. As he neared the English coast, the reality of what he'd done began to press against him. Defying orders during a major operation meant more than a reprimand. It was insubordination, possibly even treason, depending on how command chose to see it. He imagined the faces that would greet him when he rolled onto the runway, the officers with their cold stares, the paperwork already waiting, the verdict predetermined. Yet under the weight of it all, a strange calm settled over him, the kind of calm that comes when a man has already accepted his fate. He'd seen enough of war to know that not every battle was fought in the air. Some were fought afterward, in rooms filled with smoke and silence, with words sharper than bullets. The Mustang's landing gear groaned as it descended. The airfield came into view, the same rows of hangars and dispersal bays he had left behind hours earlier, but it felt different now. The world felt older. Men on the ground saw him coming and scattered to clear the runway. When the wheels touched down, the tires screamed, smoke curling from the friction, as Widow's Whale slowed to a trembling halt. The engine coughed, then died, leaving only the ringing in his ears and the faint hiss of cooling metal. Mercer sat there for a long moment, helmet still on, hands gripping the stick as if afraid the world would disappear if he let go. The canopy opened with a reluctant hiss, and the cool air hit him like a slap. Officers were already running toward the plane. Colonel Reeves was among them, tall, composed, his face unreadable. Mercer climbed out slowly, boots hitting the ground, legs weak beneath him. No one spoke. For a moment, it was just the sound of the wind against the empty field and the ticking of the Mustang's engine as it cooled. Then Reeves said flatly, "You're finished, Lieutenant." Mercer met his gaze. "If that's what it takes," he replied. Reeves didn't answer. He just gestured toward the control tower. 2 MPs stepped forward. The world shrank to the small sound of their boots crunching on gravel as they led him away. Inside the operations room, the air was thick with tension. Radio operators moved like ghosts between tables, eyes flicking up as Mercer passed. The invasion updates came in bursts, some good, most catastrophic. Reeves stood by the window, his back to the room, watching the grey sky beyond the glass. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he said finally. Mercer stood silently. "You broke formation, stole a plane, violated direct orders. Men have been grounded for less. Men have been court-martialed." Mercer's voice was quiet, steady. "And how many are alive now because I did?" Reeves turned, eyes narrowing. "You think that matters? You think heroics make up for insubordination?" Mercer didn't answer. He knew nothing he said would change the outcome. But the colonel's next words came softer, less certain. "Reports from the channel say your interference cleared a path for several bomber groups. One of them destroyed the 88s overlooking Omaha. The beachhead might hold because of it." Reeves paused. "But that doesn't absolve you." Mercer nodded. "I didn't do it for absolution." The colonel studied him for a long moment, then looked away. "You'll be confined to quarters until further notice." That was all. No shouting, no ceremony, just the quiet inevitability of consequence. Mercer saluted, turned, and walked out. The MPs followed him halfway before Reeves's voice stopped them. "Let him go." They hesitated, then obeyed. Mercer stepped into the open air, where the fog was lifting and the sound of distant engines carried across the field. The sky above was clearing now, streaks of sunlight cutting through the grey. Somewhere across the channel, men were still fighting for a beachhead that might not have existed without him. He didn't feel pride or regret, only the weight of knowing he had done what needed to be done, no matter the cost. That night, alone in his barracks, Mercer sat by the window, watching the last traces of sunset fade into darkness. From somewhere far away came the muffled roar of planes returning, engines sputtering, wings pitted with shrapnel. He thought of those pilots, the ones who had seen him diving through the storm, and wondered if they understood why. Maybe they did. Maybe they didn't need to. In war, you didn't fight for medals or recognition. You fought because something in you refused to watch others die when you could still move, still act, still try. Outside, the lights of the airfield blinked like tired stars, each one marking a man who had gone and might never return. Mercer leaned back, exhaustion finally settling over him. Tomorrow, they would decide his fate. But tonight, for the first time in months, he felt something close to peace. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, of men who chose courage over command, subscribe to the channel and help keep their legacy alive. Night fell over Bodney with the weight of a confession. The rain began just after midnight, soft at first, then steady, pattering against the corrugated roofs of hangars and the glass panes of the control tower. The air smelled of oil and wet grass, and the field was a dim ocean of shadows and muted light. Inside his barracks, Mercer lay awake, boots still on, listening to the wind drag the rain sideways against the tin walls. Sleep wouldn't come. It never did after a mission, not when the adrenaline drained away and left only ghosts in its place. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the channel again, saw the bombs fall, saw the silhouettes of men crawling through chaos while the sky burned above them. He'd done what he thought was right, but the mind is cruel and silent. It never lets righteousness stay clean. It whispers questions until you start to wonder if the things you did to save others only damned yourself a little more. The door creaked open. A shadow filled the frame, rain dripping from a trench coat. It was Captain Hale, one of the intelligence officers. He looked older than Mercer remembered, the lines on his face deeper, the eyes heavier. He held a folder under his arm. "Colonel wants to see you," he said quietly. Mercer nodded, rose, and followed him through the rain. They crossed the airfield in silence, boots splashing through shallow puddles, the wind tugging at their jackets. In the distance, the hangars loomed like sleeping beasts, the smell of fuel and burned metal hanging thick in the damp air. Somewhere, a generator hummed, and the faint glow of lamps flickered through the fog. It was the same field Mercer had left that morning, but it felt changed, hollowed out, as if the ghosts of the day were still circling above, waiting for dawn. They entered the operations building. Inside, It was warm, the air heavy with cigarette smoke and fatigue. Reeves stood by a table cluttered with maps and reports. He didn't look up immediately. On the far wall, a radio played a low, scratchy broadcast from the BBC. A voice was reading the first official statements about the landing. The Allies had established footholds on the beaches of Normandy. Casualties were heavy, resistance fierce, success uncertain. Reeves turned the radio off and finally looked at Mercer. His expression was different this time. Not anger, not even disapproval, but something quieter, more difficult to name. "They're saying your flight made a difference," he said. "Those bombers took out 3 gun batteries before they could wipe out the landing. Command knows that." He paused. "But they also know you disobeyed a direct order. That's not something they can overlook." Mercer nodded slowly. "I understand." Reeves stepped closer, folding his arm. "Do you? Because there's a difference between understanding and accepting. Understanding means you knew what you were doing. Accepting means you're ready to live with it." His tone softened, almost imperceptible. "There's talk of pulling you from the roster permanently, maybe even transferring you to training command." Mercer didn't respond. The silence stretched until Reeves sighed. "You remind me of pilots I knew in the last war. Brave, reckless, the kind who didn't live long enough to figure out the difference." He turned away, resting both hands on the edge of the table. "You think defying orders makes you noble, but what it really makes you is dangerous. To yourself and to everyone who believes in discipline." Mercer looked at him, voice steady. "If discipline means watching men die when you can stop it, then maybe I'd rather be dangerous." Reeves stared at him, jaw tight, then looked down. "You always have an answer, don't you, Lieutenant?" He closed the folder on the table and handed it over. "These are reports from the squadrons over Normandy. I want you to read them." Mercer flipped it open. The first page listed aircraft losses, dozens of names, familiar ones. The second page, marked with smudged fingerprints, showed damage assessments. Then came a photo, grainy, taken from a bomber's gun camera, of a lone P-51 diving through flak, smoke spiraling around it like a storm. Under it, a simple note: "Unidentified friendly fighter disrupted German batteries, enabling strike group to proceed." Reeves watched him read. "That's you, Mercer. You saved them, but no one will ever know it." For a long time, neither man spoke. Rain drummed against the windows, and the low hum of the generator filled the silence. Finally, Reeves said, almost reluctantly, "I'm not going to court-martial you, not because you deserve leniency, but because we need men like you. The war isn't over, and I can't afford to waste a pilot who can do what you did today. But from now on, you fly when I say, and only when I say. Are we clear?" Mercer nodded once. "Clear." Reeves's voice lowered. "And Mercer, whatever you think this was, don't let it make you believe you're untouchable. Men who start thinking that way don't last long." When Mercer left the room, the rain had stopped. The clouds were beginning to break apart, letting the moonlight spill over the wet tarmac. The airfield felt quiet now, emptied of tension. The kind of silence that follows after history has already made its move. He walked to the edge of the runway and looked up. Above him, the stars were faint, blurred by the remnants of mist. But they were there, constant, patient, indifferent to the wars of men. He thought of the bombers crossing back over the channel, the crews exhausted but alive. He thought of the soldiers on the beaches, clinging to ground bought with blood. And he thought of how, for all his defiance, he was still just one man in a machine built to devour countless others. The next morning would bring orders, briefings, perhaps even apologies masked as reprimands. But for now, there was only the stillness of the field and the echo of engines that had carried him through hell and back. Mercer exhaled, the breath fogging in the cold air, and for a moment he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, breaking the rules had given the world one more chance to see another sunrise. "Now I want to hear from you. If you were in Mercer's place, would you have taken off against orders to save them? Comment below and write this: I would have flown." Days passed, but time on the airfield didn't move the way it used to. It hung in the air like the smoke from burned oil, thick, slow, inescapable. The pilots went up and came back in steady rhythm, some limping home with holes in their wings, some never returning at all. Each dawn brought another mission brief, another flight roster, another chance for the war to decide who stayed and who disappeared. For Lieutenant Jack Mercer, those days were a strange kind of exile. He was still grounded, officially, confined to base for evaluation. Every morning, he watched the others climb into their Mustang, engines roaring like heartbeats too strong to control, and every evening he counted how many returned. The war went on without him, as it always did, grinding forward with mechanical indifference. But Mercer was not built for stillness. He could feel the restlessness crawling under his skin, the pull of the sky whispering that his place wasn't here on the ground. It never had been. He spent his mornings in the hangar, helping the crew chief with maintenance work he wasn't supposed to be doing. Widow's whale sat there like a caged thing, its wings cleaned and polished, its bullet holes patched but still visible beneath fresh paint. The mechanics treated it like a relic, half cursed, half holy. Some swore the engine sounded different now, as if it carried the memory of that forbidden flight. Mercer didn't argue. Machines had memories, he believed. They carried echoes of the hands that built them and the souls that flew them. When he worked on her, he didn't think about punishment or redemption. He thought about the way the plane had felt when it broke through the clouds over Normandy, the weightlessness, the raw, terrifying clarity of purpose. Nothing on the ground could ever match it. At night, the pilots gathered in the mess hall. The atmosphere had changed since D-Day. There was laughter, but it was the brittle kind that cracked if you listened too long. They spoke of Normandy in fragments, of cliffs and smoke, of paratroopers hanging from trees, of the sound of German 88s hammering the earth. Mercer mostly listened. He'd been part of it, yet he was an outsider to their stories. Word of his unsanctioned flight had spread quietly, passed from one squadron to another like a rumor with too much truth to ignore. Some called him reckless. Others called him a savior. He didn't correct either. The truth was simpler and heavier. He'd acted because he couldn't stand still while others were dying. There was nothing heroic in that, only instinct. One evening, Captain Hale joined him at the far end of the table, carrying a small stack of folded papers. "Got something for you," he said, setting them down. "Reports came in from the bomber crews you helped over Normandy." Mercer unfolded the first one. The handwriting was jagged, hurried, smudged by water or sweat. It was from a lieutenant in the 322nd Bomb Group. The message was brief. "We saw your Mustang dive through the flak. Thought you were done for. You cleared those guns. If we made it home, it's because you were there." Mercer read it twice. The words simple, but heavy enough to press against his chest. The second letter was shorter still, unsigned. "Whoever you are, I hope command doesn't break you for saving us." He folded them carefully and handed them back. "Keep them," Hale said. "They're yours." That night, Mercer didn't sleep again. He sat outside the barracks under a pale half moon, the cool wind brushing across the grass, carrying the faint scent of fuel and rain. The sky above him was clear for once. No bombers, no searchlights, no thunder of engines, just stars. He thought about the men who had written those notes. Somewhere out there, they were still flying missions, still threading through enemy fire, still trusting that someone, somewhere, would watch their backs. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was what the war was really about. Not strategy, not orders, not medals, but those unspoken promises between strangers in the same storm. He thought, too, about the cost of defiance. Every choice carved something out of a man. Every disobedient act left a scar deeper than shrapnel. He had done what he believed was right, and yet the guilt never fully left him. Not guilt for the rules he broke, but for the realization that one act of courage couldn't stop the machine of war from turning. The beaches of Normandy were secure now, but the fighting had only begun to move inland, toward hedgerows, toward towns with names that would soon become legends soaked in blood. He wanted to be there. He wanted to keep flying. But for now, he could only wait and listen to the engines overhead, imagining where they were going and how many would come back. By the end of that week, command's silence became its own kind of message. There would be no court-martial, no commendation either, just a note on the board that said, "Mercer reinstated to flight duty." No explanation, no acknowledgement, but that was how the war worked. Quiet punishment, quieter mercies. The next morning, he returned to the hangar before sunrise. Widow's whale was already being fueled, her silver skin catching the first faint light. The crew chief glanced up and grinned faintly. "Back where you belong, sir." Mercer said nothing, only patted the side of the plane. The metal was cold, but alive. He climbed in, checked the instruments, and for the first time since Normandy, the sky felt close again, close enough to touch. Somewhere far beyond the Channel, France was still burning. The war would demand more from him, as it always did. But for now, as the propeller spun to life and the engine's roar filled his chest, Mercer felt the simplest, most human thing a man could feel in the middle of a world tearing itself apart. Purpose. The first mission, after his reinstatement, came sooner than expected. 3 days after D-Day, the weather cleared over northern France, and orders came down for long-range escort runs to support advancing ground forces. Mercer's name was on the list again, almost like it had never been gone. No one mentioned the grounding. No one mentioned Normandy. The airfield worked on the principle that silence kept the world turning. The morning was cool and bright, the fog gone, replaced by the pale gold of summer sunlight cutting through the dew. Mechanics moved between aircraft like ants, voices low, movements efficient. Widow's Whale stood ready at the far end of the line, her silver wings gleaming as if she had been waiting for. Mercer checked her over with the same quiet care he always had, running a hand along the leading edge of the wing, feeling the faint hum in the metal, the tension of an engine eager to breathe again. Takeoff came just after 6. The sky opened up above them, endless and blue. The squadron climbed into formation, sunlight flashing across their canopies like shards of glass. Beneath them, the channel shimmered with the ghosts of the invasion fleet, and beyond it, the fields of Normandy stretched into green and brown mosaics broken by smoke. The German lines were retreating inland now, scattering under the relentless push of Allied armor, but the Luftwaffe wasn't done yet. Somewhere up ahead, radar had picked up movement, fighters regrouping near Argentan. Mercer's pulse steadied. This was the part of war he understood, the clean geometry of the sky, where instinct mattered more than politics, and where every decision was absolute. They reached enemy airspace within the hour. The call came over the radio. Bandits! 11 o'clock high. Mercer spotted them first, dark crosses against the light, Messerschmitts diving fast. The formation broke, engines howling as contrails twisted into spirals. In seconds, the sky turned into a storm of speed and sound. Tracers cut through the air, bright threads of death stitching between clouds. Mercer rolled hard right, diving beneath an enemy fighter, his guns flashing. The Messerschmitt exploded in a burst of fire and smoke, fragments scattering across the sky. Another came from behind. He pulled up sharply, feeling the G-force crush his ribs, the horizon spinning in a blur of blue and white. A burst of enemy fire grazed his left wing, tearing through the paint, but missing the fuel line by inches. The Mustang shuddered, but held. The fight stretched across miles of open air. Mercer's voice stayed calm over the radio, calling targets, directing his wingmen, weaving through danger with a precision that came not from arrogance, but from a deep, instinctive understanding of chaos. He wasn't flying for medals. He was flying to bring his men home, to protect the bombers that lumbered across the sky behind them, slow and vulnerable. That was his job. That was his redemption. By the time the last German plane went down, the sky had gone strangely quiet. Smoke hung in thin grey trails that drifted lazily toward the ground. Mercer's breathing was shallow, his arms trembling from the strain, his flight suit soaked with sweat. He glanced at his fuel gauge, low again, always low, but there was time enough to make it back. The radio crackled with laughter, relief, fragments of disbelief that they were all still alive. "Hell of a fight, Widow One," someone said. Mercer didn't answer. He leveled out, letting the Mustang glide through the calm air, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself to breathe without counting seconds. The flight back to England was long, quiet, and heavy with the strange peace that follows violence. As the coastline appeared ahead, the sun was already sinking, bleeding orange across the horizon. The airfield looked small from above, insignificant against the vastness of the world. Yet to the men returning, it was everything, a promise, a refuge, a reminder that for one more day they had survived. Mercer landed last, wheels kissing the runway with the soft finality of exhaustion. When the propeller wound down, the silence pressed against him, thick and absolute. He sat there for a long moment, staring at his reflection in the cracked glass of the instrument panel. The man staring back looked older, harder. War aged you in hours, not years. That night, in the mess hall, the squadron toasted quietly to their success. Reeves was there, standing apart, a glass in hand but saying nothing. When their eyes met, the colonel gave a small nod, barely visible, but enough. It wasn't forgiveness or approval. It was something else. Acknowledgement. For men like them, words were unnecessary. The nod meant more than any medal could. Later, as Mercer walked back to his quarters, under a sky thick with stars, he thought of everything that had happened. The forbidden dive, the punishment, the return, the endless wheel of missions and losses. He realized there was no real end to it. Victory wasn't a single moment. It was a long, drawn-out survival, paid for inch by inch. But in that survival, there was meaning. Every man who came back made the sacrifice of those who didn't count for something. That was the quiet truth of war, the one no one ever wrote down. Mercer stopped at the edge of the airstrip, the cool wind sweeping across the open field. Widow's Whale sat there under the moonlight, silver and still, waiting for dawn. and the next flight, the next fight, the next choice that might cost him everything. He watched her for a long time, the hum of distant engines blending with the rhythm of his heart, and understood that he would keep flying until either the war or his own luck ran out. That was his duty, his curse, and his peace. Stories like this aren't just about war. They're about the choices that define who we are when no one's watching. If you want to keep hearing these untold moments of courage and consequence, make sure to subscribe and be part of keeping their memory alive. Weeks turned into months, and the war pressed deeper into Europe like an unstoppable tide. The Allied advance crawled through hedgerows and ruined towns, leaving behind fields of smoke and silence where villages once stood. For the pilots of Bodny, every sunrise was borrowed time. The missions grew longer, the losses heavier, and the sky, once a symbol of freedom, had become a ledger written in contrails and fire. Through it all, Mercer kept flying. Each time his wheels left the ground, he wondered if it would be the last. But there was no hesitation in him. The fear had burned away long ago, leaving only a quiet resolve that guided his hands on the controls. Widow's wail had become a familiar companion in that endless dance between life and oblivion. Her engine, a voice that spoke only to him. Together, they carved paths through storms of steel, escorting bombers, strafing columns, surviving by fractions of seconds. The men around him began to change. The laughter at night grew rarer, the jokes darker. New pilots arrived to replace those who didn't return, their faces young and uncertain, their confidence still unscarred. Mercer became something like a myth among them, the one who had defied orders on D-Day, who dove through flak and lived to tell about it. They whispered his story in the hangars, passing it along like a legend carved out of exhaustion. He never confirmed it, never denied it. Myths had more power when left unanswered. He wasn't looking for glory. He just wanted to make sure the next boy sitting in a cockpit knew what courage really meant. Not medals, not orders, but the moment you choose to act because doing nothing would break something inside you forever. By autumn, the air over France had changed. The Luftwaffe was weaker now, but desperation made them dangerous. The missions became routine in name only. Escorts, reconnaissance, strikes, but each one carried the same silent gamble. One afternoon, while flying over the Ardennes, Mercer's formation was ambushed by a swarm of Fokker wolves. The fight was brutal and fast. He lost 2 men before it even began. Widow's wail dove and twisted through the chaos, her guns flashing, her frame rattling with near misses. Mercer's focus narrowed to instinct and survival. When the smoke cleared, they were alone again, the sky eerily calm. He returned to base with bullet holes through the fuselage, the smell of burned oil filling the cockpit. The crew chief stared at the damage and shook his head. "She shouldn't still be flying," he said. Mercer just looked at the plane and replied quietly, "Neither should I." As winter closed in, the airfield turned grey with frost. Letters from home arrived less often now. The world beyond the war seemed like a story someone else had written. Mercer spent his nights in silence, writing names in a small notebook. Pilots lost, men remembered. Each name was a promise that someone would not be forgotten. On New Year's Eve, he sat outside the hangar, watching snow fall over the runway. The world felt distant, suspended in the pale glow of floodlight. Somewhere far away, the war was turning toward its end, though no one there dared to believe it yet. Victory was a word that belonged to generals and politicians. For men like Mercer, survival was enough. When the news finally came in the spring, Germany collapsing, the Allies pushing into Berlin, there were no celebrations at Bodny, only a strange, heavy quiet. The men who had survived simply stared at one another, unsure what to do with the silence left in the war's wake. On his final day of flight, Mercer took Widow's wail up one last time, not on a mission, not under orders, but because he couldn't leave without saying goodbye to the sky. He climbed high above the clouds, where the world was clean and endless, and for a few moments there was no war, no fear, no consequence, just wind, light, and the hum of the Merlin engine echoing through his bones. When he landed, he shut down the engine slowly, hand resting on the throttle, eyes closed. It was over. Years later, long after the guns had gone silent, people would ask about that pilot who defied orders and dove into the storm to save a mission that might have failed without him. Some said he was reckless. Others said he was brave. The truth, as always, was quieter. Jack Mercer was neither hero nor fool. He was a man who refused to watch the world burn when he still had fuel left to fly. His name faded from the reports, his story buried under newer wars and louder victories. But the echoes remained, in the roar of engines, in the streak of contrails across a morning sky, in the knowledge that sometimes doing the right thing means standing alone. And somewhere, in an old airfield-turned-museum, Widow's Wail still stands, her metal worn but proud, the faint marks of flak and time still etched into her wings. Children press their hands to the glass and read the small plaque beneath her nose. P-51 Mustang, pilot unknown, flew unauthorized sortie on June 6, 1944. Mission successful. They never know the full story, but maybe they don't need to. Maybe the sky remembers for them. If you believe stories like this deserve to live on, real courage, real sacrifice, subscribe to the channel, because remembering is its own act of honor.